Okay, so for many of you guys, it's probably your first time maybe working on like a sizable portion project where you haven't really written that many that much code that you kind of design yourself on how the things interact with each other. For most of your classes, you just have a function to implement, you implement it, and you move on. So as a Course 6 senior, I have been in many sad situations, and I'm here to share the miserable experiences with you all so that you guys are at least a little bit less miserable. Okay, so when you're writing code, in an ideal world, you kind of want to have, like fully tested, no hacky things doing, you're never repeating yourself, blah, 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 all those like cool coding practices which you kind of want to follow. But in reality, it kind of sucks. So fully tested code doesn't really exist anywhere. Like if you look at like commercial software companies, their code coverage is not really that good either. When you try to not write hacky code, you realize you're writing your code right now in JavaScript, and JavaScript in itself is like kind of the definition of hackiness. And you guys are under a tight deadline, right? Like you guys have like a little over a week to work on your project, so you will inevitably have to do some hacky things because you just don't have enough time. And sometimes when you try to not repeat yourself and like write really good code, you realize you have to overhaul the entire structure of your application, and that just takes too much time, and it's usually not worth the effort. So most importantly though, it's important to realize that you oftentimes don't realize what sort of code structure you need or what kind of problems you will need to face until you actually have those problems. I used to have this weird thing where I tried to preemptively prevent myself from making every single type of mistake and end up just not doing any work. I would simply be like, okay, what if I run into this situation, this problem as I'm developing my code? I don't know if that's possible or not, but I still spend time thinking and brooding over it. And what that ends up putting you in a situation of is you are not getting any work done, but you are getting stressed, and that's bad. So oftentimes a rule of thumb is just keep writing code and just keep implementing something until you realize, wow, this is a hodgepodge mess. I better go back and clean it up. You think that's kind of bad, but it's good in a sense that when you're writing your code, you realize like kind of the intricacy of the problem and actually realize what kind of problems I will actually care about and which ones don't really matter. So with that preface, I'll go into like good coding practices, what's actually important. So I'll have this in a format where I kind of tell you guys a personal story. Most of them are sad. And what I did, which was bad, and what I should have done, which was good. Okay. So you guys will probably have or have already experienced one or another version of these stories for a lot of them. So I'm working on a lab assignment for a course. So I've been implementing like this huge ass function for the last 3 hours, and I'm like, I haven't tested this code, but I'm also so close to being done. And I have a nagging feeling that none of it works, but I just keep typing because I kind of want to, escape reality and fool myself into thinking I'm actually getting work done, I'm writing code. So, bad solution. What I did on some other occasion, not this anecdote I'm speaking of, is I feel super lost, ask my teammate to debug my code, and kind of just run away. It's kind of a cruel thing to do to your teammate, but that's one thing you shouldn't do. Another thing is, I'm almost done, I'll just finish it and then debug it. Like, I wrote this much code, and if I write this little, it'll all be good. And then you finish it, and then you look at your code and you press run and you're like, 30 plus errors, and the very top error is you don't have some indentation or bracketing correct. You're not gonna end up debugging all these lines of code. In the process of debugging, you'll probably break whatever logic you implemented to begin with. A decent solution to this problem is stop right where you are and take a bathroom break. Just take your mind off it. You don't want to be in this very bad, vicious, thought process of I can finish this, and you just kind of power through. It's like doesn't really work that way. So like when you come back, sit back down, just comment everything you've done out, and try to incorporate like little by little. Put some of the code in. Try running it. Running it is like very important. Running it, and if it works, you're like, okay, I know this part of the code works. Now I can move on and try to go with that. But in all due honesty, the best solution is just to not be in that situation to begin with. It's better if you don't do this weird commenting things out and re-implementing things bit by bit, but you just start re-implementing it bit by bit. So lesson 1 is code in small chunks, make incremental changes. Sometimes you'll be in a situation where you make a very small, implement a very small function, and then you improve upon it, and then you improve upon it, and then you improve upon it, and after like 6-7 iterations, you look at the final function, and it looks nothing like what you implemented at first. And then you're gonna be like, wait, then if I'm not using any of my original code, what's the point of having it written? Why couldn't I have just gotten to the end result? But I stated this at yesterday's lecture as well, but I'll just repeat myself. It's the process that matters. This process of iterating from one version of the code to another, to another, to another, until you reach your final result. This process is very important because in this process, you're actually thinking about the problem. You're like putting more effort into it, and then you're adding more value as you add more lines of code. So don't think that when you're implementing a very simple function, be like, okay, this is simple, I shouldn't do this, I should just implement the complex version. Don't do that to yourself. It's just going to add more mental stress to you, and it's just going to decrease your efficiency. The progression of the cat book workshops is like a very good example of how you could break down your application. Like you're adding small features one by one, eventually converging to a pretty decently working application. The biggest problem with these is just don't have a huge block of thing that you don't know if it works or not. It's better to have a small thing that works than a big thing that doesn't. Talking about this workflow, lesson 2 would be like, try to rush to get something that works. Like, let's say you just started to work on a feature, right? And you don't know if it works, you're not sure how to start implementing it. In this phase, don't really think too much about code structure, writing good, particularly good code, how the feature would integrate into your app. Just erase all things, clean up your desk, and just focus in and zoom on whatever you're doing. This will help you This will help you take this thing in isolation and get a lot of work done in terms of figuring out how this thing should work, right? And when you rush through it, you very quickly get to a result. The faster you get to your first result, that's like a milestone, which means when you get a lot of work done, but it looks all crappy, but you know it works, now you can look back at your kind of shitty code and be like, okay, I got a lot of work done, now time to clean it up, so that I can look at this code tomorrow morning and still understand how it works. This second step is actually very important in you to being able to continue to add more value to whatever you're implementing. What I mean is, if you, let's say, write some shitty code that works, and then you get up for 10 minutes and then sit back down and look back at your code, you'll be very surprised by how quickly you can stop understanding what you wrote 10 minutes ago. But I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that to begin with. It happens all the time. You're just, kind of prototyping, and in that process, you want to do things as quickly as possible. It's kind of like letting your, train of thought be like matching whatever you're coding up. That way, like you're not forgetting things you were thinking about. You're just like on pace with what you're thinking about. And once you're done, you can fix it. You just fix it, and after you have like clean code, now you can move on. This is a very like nice way of like getting a lot of progress done really quickly. Okay, I said like something about like kind of encouraging like in short bursts, bad coding is okay as long as you fix afterwards. There's like a couple of things you should be like wary of when you're dealing with this kind of, you know, coding. So especially in variable names, there's like two or three. I don't know if there's more slides. Things that you should be very careful of. One is, let's say you are writing code and you're like, I should rename this variable. This variable does not make sense anymore. It does not represent what value it holds. If you think that, change the name of that variable immediately. Like immediately. You use Control F, whatever find replace function your text editor has, just do it. The reason for that is when you're trying to implement something, you want your head to be focused on that thing only, and you don't want any distractions. When you have bad variable names, you have to like keep that in mind when you're coding, and then it kind of like confuses you down the road once you have more and more things you need to keep track of. So you want to minimize the number of things you keep track of, and practically, I found this to be like the kind of thing that made me miserable was, I'd be like, okay, this technically isn't the correct variable name, but I will say the variable name will still be arbitrary name and whatever. I'll just keep it in mind, and eventually these things like, pile up, and then at some point you're just like, not really thinking, you're just trying to figure out the mess you made in your head. Another thing is, let's say you're implementing something and then you're like, oh, this variable's wrong, I'll rename it. And 2 minutes after, you're like, wait, no, I need to rename it again. And you keep doing that. That's actually a sign that the logic of how you're implementing this entire like blob of code is probably wrong. It means there's something that's like, connecting in your head incorrectly, and therefore you're going back and forth into thinking about how you're implementing it. So you are like, okay, I think this variable means blah, and then after a while you think about it more and be like, maybe not, and then you start second guessing and third guessing yourself. At that point, you're just like, okay, I think there's some sort of flaw in the like overarching logic I am trying to implement here. So this is a very good like symptom that you should take a step back and think about the problem. Maybe get a pen and paper and try drawing like what you're trying to do. Something that takes you away from just mindlessly coding and just writing really buggy code. And last thing is, when you're writing code, like sometimes you'll be like very tempted to write very descriptive, paragraph-long variable names just because so. But what I've found more like of an important thing is the shape your code indents in and out actually matters a lot. So if you have like very long variable names and very long expressions, it's like very hard to see what is going on from like a distance, and that kind of confuses your brain. So like if you like make sure you don't go overboard on naming your variables and making it ridiculously long, and you like indent and like do your indentations properly, like it'll be a lot more easier to write code because it just looks prettier, it's easier on your mind. So all these things are just kind of like tricks you can do to kind of push away things that don't matter when you're trying to implement something. Okay, this is like an extreme example of bad variable names, okay? So I'm at a hackathon, and it's 5 a.m. My teammate wrote some code, and wrote this code and left and take a nap, and I need to debug it because it doesn't fucking work. Okay, what is wrong here? You guys see this? It's a capital T. I'm just so tilted at this. Yeah, I've been memeing about this for the past like 3 years. It's great. Okay, and then there's another one. This is like still hammering actually? Never mind, this is the next lesson. Okay. So, enough with the variable names. Now, moving on. So I just implemented something really cool, and it seems to work. Like I just tried one input and it works. I'm like, great, this is good. I made progress, and I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna push this and share it with my teammates. And then as you're about to do that, you're like, wait, I was meaning to do this housekeeping on my code, so I'll clean up this, add comments here, move this here. I mean, I'm not changing anything. I'm just organizing my code. And a bad solution to do is I apply whatever I was just thinking, this moving code up and down, adding comments. Be like, what could go wrong, right? It's a small change. Nothing moved, and then I crash my site. So this is bad. The second one would be apply all the changes and then try testing, and then you're like, oh shit, it broke. So now you're not sure whether your original implementation was wrong or whatever you just did fucked everything up. That's just bad. So now the number of moving parts you need to debug just increased by a lot. And if you did a lot of code organization, you just kind of shot yourself in the foot. So a good solution would be, test the thing you just implemented, be sure it works, and then do the code organization. Just put a kind of pin in the middle. Be like, okay, I know up to this point it worked. An even better solution would be make the thing work, commit, and then do the housekeeping and do another follow-up commit. That way, if you know that something broke at the very end, you can just hop back to the commit right before the housekeeping and see if it still works. And if it still works, you're like, okay, whatever I was doing in this housekeeping step, I probably screwed up, so I know where to debug now. So, okay, then moving on. This is the next thing, actually. I lied. This lesson is not related to this anecdote. Just ignore it. Okay, so the next thing you need to think about is you'll do hacky things when you're desperate. There's some things in Catbook that are kind of hacky, but what we did to make sure, it's important to keep track of these, even if you do them. Be like, okay, I just need to, right next to the line of code that I think is kind of sketchy, but it still works for my use case, I'll just put a comment being like, warning, this might screw things up later, but for now this is fine. And then you can just be on your merry way and keep coding. And then at some point a bug will creep up, and then you're like, where could this bug have come from? There's a very high likely chance that it came from the hacky thing you did way earlier, and if you just put a comment there, now you know where it is, so you don't have to think about it. Just makes life easier. Next lesson is you don't know how your code should be organized until it is disorganized. You shouldn't go be like, okay, I'm gonna do this really cool MVC architecture, blah 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 whatever, and just do every file has one line of code and that's it, and then there's some master file that hooks everything together. This is not how you do it. There's a very fine balance to reach where on one side you want some helper functions to make your code readable, digestible, debuggable. You don't have large blobs of 300 lines of code in one function. But on the other side, you don't want to go too overboard and try to write an architecture for your code base. A good rule of thumb to go by is code until you start feeling a little bit uncomfortable about the organization of your code. You're like, okay, this is kind of messed up. I need to go back and fix it. But until then, it's better to keep it a little bit on the disorganized side. Be like, okay, I know, as long as you can keep it in your head, be like, I know what's going on. I don't need to go overboard and try to organize something. So in summary, there's a couple things I mentioned. I'll re-summarize them again. 1, code in small chunks and make incremental changes. don't have a lot of untested code. If you're like writing 15 lines of code that you have not run at all, it's kind of, you're begging for trouble. 2, be in a very rush to get something working, and as soon as you get it working, go back and fix your code so that it's actually readable and understandable. Like if you're writing bad code, don't be like, oh no, I shouldn't do this. It's fine as long as you fix it later. 3, if you know you're writing bad code and you can't do anything about it because that's the best you can muster, just put a comment there or two. Be like, okay, this is bad. It probably will break later, but for now it's fine. And just jot it down. And 4, when you're organizing your code, don't go overboard about it. Just do it as it comes. Okay, Aaron, I can keep
Heroku's
going,
online.
but whatever.
Heroku's working, so I think maybe it makes more sense to do deployment and then talk about debugging.
Okay.
All right, let's do it. All right, guys, Heroku saved us, so it's back online. So, yay.
Cool.